We'll take a short 5-minute break around 10 o'clock in the morning. And with that, I am so happy to welcome Nick Stone, who is a partner with Cherry Beckert's Risk and Accounting Advisory Services practice and is Cherry Beckert's Risk Advisory Leader. Nick will be presenting on effective risk assessments for Virginia internal auditors. And Nick, please take it away.
It is mine. Hey guys, good morning. Before I go off of this introductory slide with all the Zoom hygiene here, this topic today is one of my favorites. I really do enjoy the topic because it is so foundational to what it is that the internal audit function does. And we have 2 hours to do it. Usually I jam this thing into 60 minutes and everybody takes their CPE credit and runs. But we've got 2 hours here, which makes this a workshop. And I'm used to doing this for literally hundreds of people at the same time, at least during this COVID era. We have, what do we have, Maddie? About 35 people on. To me,
yep, 35.
That makes this an intimate setting. And I really do encourage you to interrupt me. Ask questions, turn your camera on, take it off mute. Make this more of a conference room, workshop than a CPE with everybody on mute. We do have 2 hours lined up and we want to give 2 CPE credits away. If I don't have interactivity and questions and some dialogue, yeah, you might get 1.5. All right. So that's my ask today. We've got a lot of good content here. I'm going to be taking maybe not a leisurely pace, but I'm not going to be ripping through it like I sometimes do on these webinars. So with that said, let's step into this. So again, this is one of my favorite topics. It's my favorite topic because risk assessments help us understand what it is we are trying to accomplish. It forces us to understand organizational objectives and figure out what are the impediments to those objectives and setting up strategies to work around them, work through them, avoid them, share them, you name it. Again, this is foundational to what we do. And we can use a lot of creativity to do more effective risk assessments. But one of the themes that we're going to talk about today is the fact that if you picked up a risk management methodology out there, whether it's academic, COSO related, ISO related, and these things are potentially complex. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of investment. There are detailed hierarchies and taxonomies of risk. There's specific methodologies to go through. They take a heck of a lot of investment at the top of the organization to try to push them through. And that may not always be realistic. And over the years, I've realized that, at least from an internal audit perspective, and even from, I'll call it an internal consulting perspective, process improvement, understanding objectives and risks to those objectives, we need a more pragmatic approach. So that's the impetus for this whole session of webinar series that I do, is how to acknowledge all of the really solid methodology and frameworks like COSO and ISO, but kind of rip the guts out of them and put it in the lens of internal audit and what we need to do in our professions to not only meet the standards that we have, whether it's specific to Virginia or specific to the IIA or other regulatory standards that you might be thinking about. And we can touch on some of those. Like one of the things we're talking about right now is the CARES Act, for example, and you've got UGG internal control requirements. You guys have ARMIX up in Virginia. There's all sorts of different regulatory considerations that this is highly applicable to. So we're going to go through that, but that's kind of the framework that we're going to work around today, and at least the underlying theme, the thread that I'm going to try to pull through this whole conversation. All right, Cherry Beckert, if you haven't worked with us before, you know what? I'd be a little surprised, at least in Virginia. We have old roots in public sector and specifically in Virginia. We've been headquartered up there in Virginia for a while. I say up there. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina right now. Maddie's down in Nashville. And we cover the entire Southeast, basically from, well, I'll call it Rhode Island down to Miami and as far west as Texas right now. But we do a heck of a lot of work up in your neck of the woods, and we've been in Virginia for over 70 years. So looking forward to sort of continuing the relationships. I'm going to make the assumption that many of you already are hanging out with some of our financial audit folks. And if not, I'd love to introduce you. And, if you're an internal audit person, I'd love to meet you. I lead our risk advisory practice. And at least risk advisory for us, and the way I explain it to folks is, we're the internal control, compliance, regulatory, side of the practice. But we really help organizations leverage internal control to meet objectives, whether it's protecting value, adding value, enabling performance of the organization, or building resilience. That's what we do. And that fits really nicely into kind of what we're going to talk about today. All right. So here's the plan for the morning. We've got 2 hours. We're going to take a break midway, right around 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. The second hour is probably going to be just wrapping up some of the content and then getting into some of the tools that I've got handy to walk you through. And this is where I'm really hoping that the facilitative, interactive workshop, sort of kicks in. So for those of you just joining, I think a couple of folks have. Again, let's try to make this interactive today. I'll give you plenty of chances to do that. And if you do have questions, Maddie's online, she's monitoring the chat. If you just want to interrupt me by taking yourself off mute, you have the power to do that. So what are we going to do today? We are going to first talk about how the risk assessment process can work. And this is our risk assessment process. This is one that we have sort of bent the rules of reality on, and we've kind of tuned it up to meet our needs as a risk advisory and consulting shop. The first thing we do is we really model the full organization. And I say the full organization here because, at least from the internal audit standards, you are encouraged to do a top-down risk-based risk assessment. And you can't do that unless you understand what's in the organization. So this is actually a really cool part of the process that we're going to talk about. Then we're going to use these things called risk criteria. These are not risk events. This is the secret sauce of the shortcut method I'm going to show you guys. But we're going to find some risk criteria that are really tuned up to your organization, whether it's your specific mission, the risk posture that you guys are thinking about. But we're going to talk about how to identify and define risk criteria that meet the needs of this risk assessment process. Then again, risk assessments, at least the way I'm going to talk about it today, I think they're relatively straightforward. They're straightforward until you try to execute it. So we're going to learn some pro tips on how to implement this process to make it interactive, to make it facilitated. This is really where the value comes in. Anybody can do a risk assessment in the dark in the internal audit shop. Complete it, lock it down, make your audit plan, and roll on. And that's not the point of this at all. The idea here of making it interactive, getting buy-in from the organization, challenging yourself and how you understand the organization, really pulling in what you understand to have changed, what's going to be changing, and really fluffing up your understanding of that overall risk environment is all about number 3. And then it's all about linking the risk assessment results to your audit plan. I think most of you are required to do that annually, if not more frequently. And that really kind of caps off the risk assessment process. And then we're going to quickly talk about different technologies that are out there right now, whether it's GRC tools or IRM, integrated risk management, or ITRM, which is the IT side of risk management. I just want to highlight some of the tools that I'm seeing, that I'm using, talk about those. We could even do a quick demo maybe if we have time. And then I thought we might just kind of open it up and have sort of a roundtable if we have time to talk about what are you guys doing? Where are you deploying risk assessments? What are your success stories, or what are your challenges? Just have a little bit of a roundtable towards the end. And again, fair warning, I've probably got a little bit over an hour, maybe hour and a half of solid content to go through here. The balance of the time is contingent on you to ask some probing questions to make it interactive. So again, take yourself off mute. Introduce yourself, lob some questions over through chat, whatever works for you. Let's see if we can get this thing more than me just talking this morning. So we got a nice small group. Maddie, what are we up to now? About 40?
Yep, 40, 43 if you count the three of us producing it.
Hey, fantastic. I'll take
Gotta count
43.
everybody.
Everybody counts here. All right, a couple resources that we're going to talk about. I do have a risk assessment template. Everybody gets some tchotchkes for showing up today. There's a risk assessment template that I've got that you're going to see throughout, especially in the latter half of this session today. We will be stepping through it. We will be putting our hands on it. We'll take a look at the one that is full of boilerplate stuff, and we'll take a look at one that we've done in the past year or so here in North Carolina that's in the public domain that we can put on the screen, talk about, but you can see the tool as it was built for a specific executive agency for the state of North Carolina. We're going to give you some examples of definitions, risk criteria definitions to help you think about how you might want to tune those up and how you score them and how you weight them. So all of that is in this tool. I say it's available in the Zoom files. I'm not going to put it there yet. We'll send it to out there after this particular call. And Maddie, if people are wanting to get their hands on it, maybe we can put that out there over the break we take at the top of the hour. Yes,
that's a great idea. We can do that.
All right, a couple more resources here. There is a book out there for risk assessments for mid-sized organizations. This is actually written by a former partner of our group who just recently retired. But a lot of the stuff that we cover is actually in this book, not all of it. And not all the shortcuts, but good content, support a retired partner. I don't think he gets any money from it, but hey, it is available in the AICPA store. But and there's a lot of tools that we're giving you that include risk libraries and assessment templates that you're going to see today, as well as that are also in this book. And if you like something that's a bit more, I'll call it authoritative, you can always go through COSO, ERM 2017, ISO 31000 2018. There's a lot of different resources to pull from here. What you're going to see today is basically us doing what a lot of consultants do, pulling the good stuff out of all the stuff and putting it into something that's a bit more cohesive and tailored to our objectives. And before I go into our first polling question, those objectives today are entirely focused on an internal audit department. It doesn't need to be a public sector department, just so happens that's you guys on the phone today. But the idea here that we're going to be stepping through is that you have an obligation to update your understanding of the organization, what it does, and all of its aspects and components, component units for since we're in the public sector side here. But understanding it in a way that is sufficient to be able to intelligently articulate your perspective on risk. This is all about helping you as a department develop perspectives on risk and pulling together the resources that you've got in a way that is aligned to those resources, in a way that is defensible. We've got a rather polarized environment right now. I mean, Virginia is not much better than North Carolina or Florida, for that matter, in terms of polarization and where things are going. We do need to make sure that we are covering our six. We need to make sure that we understand risk and that we are making sure that we are advocating for the taxpayers and where the tax dollars are going. That's your job, at least a large portion of it. So that's the context we're going to be stepping into the topics today on. And let's get one of these 8 CPE questions out of the way. I think Maddie's already launched it here, so I think you guys can see it, but no right or wrong answer here. What are your objectives today? CPE, please. Hey, that's cool. I don't mind. I get it. I think I've already met my CPE goals for the year just by doing these seminars. But some of you may be actually thinking about risk assessment. Some of you may just be trying to understand, like, okay, I know what I do, but what else could I do? How could I tune that up? Some folks are out there looking at QARs, and for some of the others, if anybody's out there as one of the 3 folks that are there, I'd be interested to understand, like, what else are you guys looking for? So here's your chance to take things off mute or send something through the chat. Is there anything else that you guys are thinking about that you'd like to see covered today? And by the way, there's 2 of you out there that I need to finish the question. So I'm trying to buy you some time. I'll be nice on this first one. All right, Maddie, how are we doing?
We are still waiting for those 2, maybe 3 folks now. I think we just had someone join our meeting. So if you haven't answered yet, oh, we just got another one.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody dial in here. And if you're having a hard time with the, with answering your questions, or you're not figuring out the technology, or you didn't hear the idea of coming in not through the web browser, you need to be on your app, but you can also send Maddie a quick note saying, hey, I'm here. Here's my answer. Yep,
for sure. Right. Okay, we are going to end the poll right now, and I'll share those results.
Cool. Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of you guys have, your existing risk assessment processes. You're just looking to say, what else is out there? How does it compare to what I'm doing? And that's cool. And that really will help drive some of the dialogue that perhaps we have towards the end of the session. All right, I'm going to close that here. And each of you, I think you just need to close out your question yourself, and we're going to keep rolling here. All right. So why do a risk assessment in the first place? Well, sometimes you have to, because the standards say to do it. Maybe there's certain statutes or regulations that say you've got to do it. Well, you guys have RMICS up there. And RMICS is more of a best practice consideration. And that's really for all agencies and departments that are supposed to be doing that. The IAA standards require you to do it in the IPPF. In the governmental auditing standards for you financial auditors out there also, stipulate the concept of a risk assessment. I think the ones that we're going to be focusing on today, I'm going to stay away from RMICS. RMICS is so darn specific. It has its own templates. It's very quantitative. In my opinion, it can be done in a dark room on a laptop without a whole lot of, feedback. It's required, first of all, and I certainly understand it. But what I want to talk about today is how do we make the process more tuned to opening our eyes to the broader organization to make sure that we can develop perspective on risk. And I think that's the goal of the IAA and the professional practices framework. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, just to have some authority, behind this drive to do an effective risk assessment. But according to the IIA, there has to be independent, objective assurance that is designed to add value and improve an organization's operations. Now that is what internal audit should do. And they do it by evaluating and improving the processes used to manage risk, control, and governance processes. There's a lot said in that. Independent, objective assurance and consulting activities designed to add value. I don't love the whole add value thing. I think it's said too much. It's well intended. It's true. But it's really hard to do. And how do we do that? And then when it's talking about improving effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance, I mean, there's a lot that's in here. The expectations are high, the budgets are low, the resources are constrained. This process that we're going to go through is really intended to help with these 2 statements. Risk assessments aren't even said in this. We'll get into the risk assessment standards in just a moment, the IAA. But my take here is that, your credibility in the organization is highly diminished without having your own independent, valid perspectives on how the organization operates, what its objectives currently are, and how they've changed and how they potentially will change. And what are the risks or the potential impediments to those objectives? you need to understand the organization. And it sounds so trivial, but I think most everybody on this call can empathize, maybe that's the right word, can empathize with the challenge of having resources that are constrained, with having an organization that is non-trivial, that's pretty darn complex. It's bigger than you are able to get your arms around and actively understand everything that's happening. It just can't happen. You need a way, you need a methodology that is repeatable to help you climb that cliff. And if you don't, if you kind of fall into the shallow rut of saying, we've got our audit plan, I'm just going to do these 3, and you just kind of keep your head down as opposed to up and eyes wide open about risk. While it's easy to do that, I think your credibility is diminished. The whole concept of understanding the organization and adding value and improving risk management is not only diminished, it's completely hamstrung, it's hindered. We have to do this well, and it's really hard. It has to be part of what we do. So we need ways to do it, and I'm hoping what we talk about today gives you that sort of pragmatic shortcut approach to do this in a more effective way. And to do this, you're going to hear me say again, like we need to be embedded with the organization. We need to be having dialogues with them. It needs to be facilitated and interactive. You need to develop an intimate understanding of the organization in which you're working. You have to. And if you're not there and the rest of your staff aren't there, you need to figure out how to get there. And my goal here is to say, I think this risk assessment tool, this process, is a way to develop that context and a way to maintain perspective. Even if you do this process at the beginning of the year, you might have context and perspective for about 3 months before everything changes. Imagine doing this process in July, August of last year, and then having COVID hit, the following February. Oops, everything's changed. How do we respond to it? So going back to the authoritative standards here. I've cherry-picked a handful of the IAA performance standards out, and I just thought I'd highlight them because there's risk assessment requirements in all of these. Section 210, that's where the chief audit executive must establish a risk-based plan to determine the priorities of the internal audit group, and it's got to be consistent with your organization's goals. Okay, that's where it starts. 2010, I think at least for the assurance standards, the A1 section of this goes on further and it says, oh yeah, and it has to be done annually. Oh, and it has to be really well documented. So I think the IAA is pretty darn clear right there. As you move up into the nature of the work in 2100, that's where the standards say that the internal audit activity really must evaluate and contribute to the improvement of the organization's governance, risk management, and control processes. But you've got to do that in a way that is systematic, repeatable, disciplined, and risk-based. So this, the internal audit credibility and value are really improved when using a process like this. And all of those words are taken straight out of 2100. So not only do we have to plan our work that way, but we have to perform our work that way. And then when you get into 2120, which is talking about risk management, this is about how you evaluate and contribute to the improvement of risk management processes. That also gets into your QAIP and stuff like that. And then the very top of this thing, when you start talking about the actual planning of specific audits, each audit plan must consider strategies, objectives, and risks relevant to that specific engagement. So here we have this pyramid of things all the way from the annual audit plan, which is sort of down at the bottom with the risk assessment, all the way up to the specific engagement performed within it. So clearly, the IAA is serious about making sure that if you have a compliant audit organization, that you need to follow the standards, and the standards are chock full of specifics on risk assessments. I think today we're going to focus primarily down at the bottom, 2010, 2100, I don't know if you guys are, IIA buffs on your performance standards or not. I'm not going to get into the QAIP stuff in specific audit planning, but what we're going to talk about paves the way for you to dive into that later. All right. This is where we start to get a bit more tactical in our approach. And we start talking about risks and what a risk assessment is and or isn't for that matter. So we have COSO ERM 2017. We have ISO 31000. COSO defines a risk as the possibility that events will occur and affect an organization's objectives. I think that's pretty clear. ISO is a bit more ambiguous, and they just say, hey, risk is the uncertainty of basically meeting your objectives. They're both valid. I kind of gravitate towards the COSO definition, at least in the ERM work that I do, at least in basically all the risk and control frameworks that I work in. We talk about risk events. But what is a risk? I think everybody on this call is like, yeah, man, I get it. You don't need to spend too much time on risk. It's real easy. So let me just ask you a question. And then I know we've got a comment in the chat, Maddie, and I'll have you facilitate that in just a second. But let's just prove to ourselves that this isn't as easy, perhaps, as you think. I like doing this question with everybody. We've been doing this for years. And if you know the answer, fantastic. But let's just see how it works. All right, you guys, what's the risk? You have 4 options on the screen. You got this concept of, basically falling down, getting hurt, and, incurring medical bills, if nothing else. But what's the risk up here? Is the risk that you incur medical bills? You max out your deductible for the year, you're out of pocket, or you get hurt, you sprain your ankle because you fell, or is falling down the risk? Or is the risk that the floor was wet and nobody mopped up, whatever fell, and that's what caused you to sprain your ankle? Which one's the risk? So that's going to lead us to our second polling question. Take a stab at this. Let's see where it comes out. I can do the play-by-play here. It looks like wet floors leading with 75%. I love this. And this is honestly, for those of you that have been or have not been on these webinars with me before, it's strikingly similar. Like every single time a new audience to this gives me kind of the same feedback. And we're at 38 out of 40. And for oh, we got 39, Mr. or Mrs. 40, are you out there? Let's get you to roll in. All right, we'll give you a couple more seconds and see if you come in on. Okay, well, let's go ahead and close that one down, Maddie. And I'm going to, and again, everybody, you can X out here. It looks like we have 2/3 picking wet floor. And by the way, 2/3 always pick wet floor. It doesn't matter if it's 50 people like we've got today or 350 like I had a couple of weeks back. It's always 2/3. So let's just see what that question is again. Okay, what is the risk? Remember COSO. Ooh, maybe this will help. Risks in the taxonomy promulgated by COSO, it's an event. And 2/3 of you said, no, it's the wet floor. That's the real risk. And this is why risk assessments are hard. Again, 2/3 of my attendees always get this wrong. People think they understand what risks are. I'm arguing with you that it's not that easy. It's not that you don't understand what risks are or risk management methodologies. It's just putting it into practice can lead you down a very dark, long tunnel because we focus on root causes. We focus on what could go wrong as opposed to the specific event. There's a lot of ways you can fall down. Wet floors is probably one of thousands, right? You could have a banana peel. Is that the risk? Now we've got 2 risks. What if Maddie pushed me down? Now I've got 3.
Oh, I would never do that.
Okay, fine. What if it's broken pavement? I mean, we could spend forever doing this. And when I'm working with my clients, sometimes this is what happens. We start having these, discussions about, what could go wrong? What are all the root causes that could cause us to ultimately have, sprained ankles, or ultimately, the impact of like medical bills. You can put this in any terms. Put it in a cybersecurity, mindset. Put it in a financial audit mindset. Put it in operational fraud. It doesn't matter. This is where the inefficiencies and the problems come in on, quote, risk assessments. We focus on the wrong thing. We focus on root causes as opposed to risk events. There's a fair amount of training on ERM to get us into the risk event, building out risk drivers, rolling those into risk events, normalizing risk events into sort of risk categories, and basically building a complex taxonomy. Y'all do not have time for that. You just don't, unless you're doing a more formalized ERM, or unless you've got something that is really requiring you to do that, like a senior leadership team that's fully bought into that approach, like a board of directors that requires you to take a formalized ERM approach. This is getting into ERM. I want to talk to you about less about ERM, as specified by COSO and ISO, and more about a risk assessment process. Here we have a nice visual that I have fully stolen from ISO 31000, 2018. But I like this because it shows the innards of a risk assessment, of basically an ERM process as defined by ISO. But here you have this lovely iterative process. Inside of it, you've got the risk assessment, you've got the risk identification, you've got risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk treatment, or what I call risk responses. You've got all the communication and the monitoring, you've got all the reporting, and this is beautifully virtuous cycle that's going on here. What we just talked about was this concept of risk identification. We haven't even gotten into the analysis yet, but if you've got zillions of risks or root causes, or you just get started on the wrong foot, it causes everything to seize. The good thing about this is that it is systematic. But what I want to talk to you about is, how can we come up with our own systematic methodology, a repeatable process, if you will, that helps us talk about risks. It helps us collaboratively achieve understanding and buy-in, that draws knowledge from your organization and process stakeholders, that pulls in the different views of many different audiences, but doesn't get us stuck in a quagmire of a more complex ERM process or risk management process that you may or may not have the time for. So I'm going to make the assumption that you're looking for a way to do your job better, not spend a whole bunch of your time, I guess a percentage of your time, on more risk assessments, but basically just to have them more effective. That's the whole concept of this webinar. So I'm going to talk to you about this risk assessment spectrum. And I've folded in the IAA standards in here just to remind us kind of where these might stand. On the left side, we have what I call true ERM. That's what I kind of just referenced, with COSO and ISO. That's really addressed by the risk management section 2120 of the IAA standards. On the right-hand side over here, this is more what I call activity level or process level risk assessments. This is when you start kind of going up the pyramid and you start getting in really into the details of a specific process. That's contemplated by 2100. What we're talking about here is we're going to straddle the fence right in the middle. That's the foundation of our pyramid according to the IAA regarding how do we build a top-down risk-based approach that helps us understand the organization, puts details and context. It maps risks to organizational objectives, and it helps us prioritize how we're going to respond to those risks that ultimately could develop into an internal audit plan. All right, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to hit all of those things. We're going to develop and maintain understanding the organization. We're going to do that in a way that is facilitative and interactive, that gets buy-in across your organization. We're going to identify risk exposure and internal control gaps subjectively using these things that I call risk criteria or risk factors that are not risk events. They're just not. We talk about risk events, we talk about root causes, but we're not going to get sucked into that black hole. This approach will help you define and defend your internal audit plan. It's going to help you rationalize and prioritize audit resources that should be contemplated in your internal audit plan. But it also is going to help you communicate out to the organization, out to the state auditor, out to other outside monitors, other interested stakeholders, legislative bodies and oversight bodies. There's a lot of folks that care about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And this is going to help you do that. So let me pause here. Maddie, do we have any questions out there in the queue? I think I see one. Is that one that we want to cover, or do we want to keep pushing ahead?
Yeah, I think this would be a pretty fitting time to dive into this. I'm actually going to respond to you, Lori, in the chat and open it up to everyone else. So Lori said she'd be interested in hearing the specific challenges that everyone is facing when performing those risk assessments. So if you guys want to unmute yourself and share with us, or if you would rather use those fast fingers again and type something into the chat, Nick and I can dive into that.
Yeah, I'd be game for it.
Good deal.
So, anybody out there want to share some of your challenges?
Okay, so I did get one from Stuart saying, what are your thoughts on sharing the risk assessment that we can create for a specific audit prior to field work with management to obtain their feedback? And what questions would you ask them?
Yeah, man.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I will show you how to do that with management, Stuart. If I go back, I'm going to go back just for a second. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to be kind of parked here in sort of the risk assessment for internal audit plan. But all you have to do is just kind of drift a little to the right. And let's just say that, hey, out of your internal audit plan in your particular department or agency, let's just say that you've got a program that, federally funded, state funded, whatever. But there's something new this year and you've put it into the audit plan to be addressed. Your internal audit risk assessment identified that. But now you need to kind of drift over into 2100 and you need to do the actual, I'll call it the program risk assessment. What are the processes and the activities in that? Like, where is the risk? What are the risks that you should be concerned about? This methodology that I'm going to show you can be further bent and contorted to provide you with an interactive tool to sit down with that program owner or that process owner, and you can use the exact same tool to elicit the same perspectives. And you do it in a way that reflects the program owner's view of risk. You're basically working with them, making sure that you're hearing them. You're not necessarily auditing them yet. You don't need to do what they're telling you to do, but you do it in such a way that is highly collaborative up front. Hopefully you're using it to listen and also to pressure test. I highly encourage you, and I think this is getting at your question, I highly encourage you to do this ahead of your audits, at the very beginning of each one of your audits. When you should be doing the risk assessment that's required by 2100, if you did it this way, you can really help yourself understand that you've fully understood the process, you have completeness on what's in that program or that process, you've articulated risks in a way that kind of gets at what it helps you get directionally at where you want to focus. There may be specific risk events that you want to highlight subsequently to doing this, but to your point, absolutely do this with your stakeholder, your process owner. during the audit or ahead of the audit to make sure that you fully understand it. And I'll show you how to make that happen. The template that I'm going to give you guys here, and I'll just flash it over here. The template that I'm going to give you is called a process or organization model assessment. So here you've got your process and your sub-process and your activity, and here's the owner that you're working with. And we're going to go through some of these risk factors in a little bit that helps you kind of dial this in. This is a very flexible tool. I mean, you're all internal consultants. So, I absolutely believe that you guys should be doing this with your internal clients or your auditees ahead of time. Hopefully that answered your question. All right.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
Yep. Anything
and thanks, Stuart. That's all I'm seeing right now. But if you do have
Okay.
more questions, just type them in the chat and we will get to them.
You got it. All right, let's keep jamming here. When you do one of these things, the outcomes of the risk assessment, and maybe this highlights what Stuart was getting at, but not only do you understand the process or the systems that are being used, but you have a way of measuring risks and internal control maturity ahead of time. Again, this is you developing your own perspectives, and you got to ask the right questions to build those perspectives, but you are subjectively measuring where you have exposure. And again, there are risks and there's risk criteria, but now I'm introducing this concept of control maturity, right? And risk and control, that combo, that's basically inherent risk, control risk, and residual risk, right? So you're getting at kind of this residual risk concept by applying this, but it's very subjective. And that measurement leads to this assessment of exposure and potential control gaps that's going to lead you, Stuart, into the areas that you want to cover in a particular audit. So I showed you the screenshot earlier on but here's another. But this highlights the steps in the process. And there's 5 of them. We're going to spend probably a fair chunk of time on 1, 2, and 3. 4 and 5, I think, are pretty standard. And it really depends on kind of your organization. But we're going to try to kind of peel back this tool, this methodology, by focusing on the idea of risk criteria as opposed to risk events. Again, that's my shortcut. I'm totally cheating doing this. And by the way, in terms of the visual here, these are my risk criteria across the top. They don't look like risks or risk events because they aren't. Then there's the idea of cataloging your business activities. This is the old Audit Universe concept. I don't know if the IIA coined the Audit Universe. I've always drifted away from using the term, but it kind of gets the point across. So I'm going to use it in this training. That the Audit Universe is the full domain that you are responsible for auditing. And it's defined at a certain level of detail that is useful. Now, if we're doing an audit plan, it might be a higher level of detail. If Stuart's doing a detailed level of an audit, and it might be a much lower level of detail. It totally depends. So this Audit Universe is all about cataloging the activities, the programs, the departments, the functions, all the way down to the activities in a process that you're going to want to evaluate as part of your risk assessment. And then it's literally filling in the boxes. And this is where, a simple process turns into sort of to a dark art here. This is where we actually characterize risks and control maturity in workshop sessions. You're working with people. You have a group of stakeholders in the meeting with your audit team. Not just you, at least 1 or 2 of you on the audit side, and then the process owners. And you're literally talking about each one of these activities or processes or the functions in the context of each one of the risk criteria and how to measure it, high, medium, low, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And we're going to give you some examples of how to do that. But this is where the perspective is gained. This is where the investment occurs, both from your group and from the broader organization. These things take time. These things, it is an investment. And it is where we get out of our audit shoes and we get into the organizational perspective of what's happening out there, so you can build perspective. So again, it's a lot of work, but this is where you really start to understand it. And by having a process that's repeatable, it forces you to get out of that shallow rut in internal audit and get out and really understand what's happening in the field. That's the risk assessment. At that point, it's really evaluating your results, normalizing your results, making sure that everything's comparable, because oftentimes there's dozens of these meetings that are happening, dozens of workshops sometimes go into this. Making sure that things are comparable and starting to elicit your feedback, comparing, your risk factors to perspective on controls, understanding what's changed or what might change, and really making sure that what you're seeing as bubbling to the top of your risk posture makes sense and can be articulated. And then it's just a matter of incorporating those risk perspectives into a game plan. What is your response? Could be a management response, could be an internal audit plan, you name it. But there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about that we can leverage. All right, so that brings us into step number 1, which is defining your risk criteria. So remember, this is the Cherry-Beckert shortcut. We use risk criteria as a proxy for risk events and root causes. We are not going down into the black hole, into the vortex of root causes. We'll be there forever and we may not get out. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about the types of risks or uncertainties that affect our organizational objectives. That means that you actually understand the organization's objectives in a context that you can align each one of these functions or programs with. So we need to come back again and again to the objectives. The tool that I'm going to show you does that, I think, in a nice way. But you're going to really drive a dialogue around these risk criteria that are proxies for risk events that could be impediments to achieving those objectives. And you need to pick the right ones. That's part of the art here. And I'm going to show you a smattering of ones. You're going to define the impact and the likelihood of each one of these criteria. You're going to build a vocabulary, a language regarding risk that you need to consistently share with each component of the organization. You need to do this in a consistent way. So building that language up front is important. Some folks like to have to weight the risk criteria. Hey, maybe regulatory compliance is much more important than third-party reliance. Okay. This depends on kind of where you are and how you want to tailor your risk assessment. But either way, you need to get mutual agreement on the level of perceived risk using these ratings, high, medium, and low. And we use, at least my team uses, sort of a 3-tier high, medium, low on these, just because it helps. I've seen some folks do high and low just to force you to, pick a side of the fence. But again, it's relative importance. Which one is higher risk as compared to something else? This is a subjective relative risk assessment process. And if you're not consistent and if you don't normalize that relativity across each one of these areas, things can get a little wonky quickly. So defining the language matters. I'll show you how we do that. Another thing that we've done in the past is using different combinations of risks. Like, what happens when one particular risk is high and then another risk is high, and they basically kind of combine to really catch our attention. What happens when we have a risk of, there's one out there that we do on organizational effectiveness reviews, which fits nicely into this methodology, where we have basically the relative importance to our mission, to our objectives. And then we have level of effort. Now, those aren't risks. Those are just basic considerations. But when you have the combination of those two things, yeah, I'm spending a lot of time on things that aren't horribly important to my organization, to my function, my department. What does that make me want to do? Right. And it leads you down a particular path. It helps you develop those perspectives. And then lastly, I think one of the most important aspects of this is considering the maturity, the perceived maturity of internal controls that are designed and placed in service to mitigate risk. That was a mouthful. Hey, how good are your controls? Hey, we're talking about whatever, grant management and whatever, allowability and disbursements. How good are your controls over those disbursements? Specific to allowability. Oh, well, tell me about it. Oh, well, that doesn't seem very mature. So we'll have to define what that means in terms of maturity. But as you're starting to probably pick up, these risk criteria drive the questions and the dialogue in your workshops. So you've got to make sure that we pick them properly. Now, how do you pick them properly? I don't know. It's up to you. But we give you a lot of things to choose from, and you don't want to pick a lot of them. Having 20 of these things is going to lead to an awfully long and boring workshop. But I think there are some that are prevalent that you are potentially obligated to ask, but not all of these. So let me just pick a handful of these, and I just want to talk to you about them. Financial impact, also known as materiality. Yeah, that matters. And that's an easy one to kind of go after and say, we're going to focus on where the money is. We're going to follow the money. That works, assuming that you believe in your financial reports and the completeness and accuracy of them. You've got mission impact. Each of us in the public sector, we are there to do a job. We have a mission, most likely aligned to your department or your agency. And whatever we do needs to be aligned to that mission. And if you have activities that are not horribly aligned to a mission or your objectives, under the lens of your mission, you need to question them. And I think this works really well when you start getting into specific programs. Probably works less well if you're on a particular process, like a business process. So complexity is one that I often see, especially if we're trying to focus on like financial reporting or operational risk in terms of error. Subjectivity is kind of the kissing cousin of complexity, but there's a lot of judgment that can cause error as well. Regulatory risks, and I'm not going to go through all of these, I'll highlight some, but regulatory risk, meaning, hey, this is a highly regulated area, or there are regulatory teeth involved. We might not be able to use the funds we were given. We might incur civil penalties and fines here. That matters. So maybe that one's important. Volume, third-party reliance. If you're doing risk management processes like, I don't know, outsourcing, co-sourcing, this is where you have part of your control environment outside of the organization. Yeah, that matters. That gets into vendor risk management and how you're handling that, but it may help or it may hurt. It depends, but understanding that matters. Changes to people, processes, technology, systems. How far away from headquarters or your home department. Basically, the further away you are, probably less controlled it is. The more centralized it is, arguably, the more controlled it is. History of error. There's a lot of stuff. Fraud is one that we pick up on a lot, especially in public sector. And by the way, I have it flagged here as inherent because we talk about inherent risk. There are other contributing factors that could increase fraud risk as well. And I've got some other stuff down here in sort of italic gray, but level of effort, I kind of hinted at earlier. You can do some operational assessments using this. Relative importance kind of goes hand in hand with level of effort. It's kind of the reciprocal. In the public sector, there's also like funding, like, is this a build service? That might have a specific risk that is different than an area that might be appropriated. So this helps set the stage for the questions you're going to ask, but it does need to be tailored to fit your team, to fit your organization and your objectives and your operations. All right, I think I'm going to clear one more slide and that will take us to the top of the hour. We might take a quick break here, but what we do next, once you've figured out what risk factors or risk criteria you want to use, is you start to develop that language. What does this mean, right? What does history of error mean? What does complexity mean? What does control maturity mean? And you need to define it in a way that you can consistently educate your organization on. And not only what does the risk factor mean, but what is the definition of high, medium, low, right? How do you educate the team on how to rank it? And this is just a little snapshot here. We usually have this embedded in one of the workbooks that I'll show you. But we usually print this thing out and actually have it in our workshops when we actually used to have meetings together. And we'd go through and be like, all right, here's what we're going to do today. We take them through the methodology and we say, and here's your cheat sheet. We're going to talk about, control maturity. And, control maturity in this case is down here at the bottom, perception or knowledge of control maturity and operation. How effective is your control? Is it designed properly? Is it operating effectively? Is it operating effectively over time? You tune up those definitions, and then you give definitions of your ratings. Well, if it's formal, then you've at least defined it. It's operating well, it's documented well, or maybe on the other end of the spectrum, it's informal if controls are fragmented, they're ad hoc, they're managed in silos. It's basically getting by because of the heroics of some person who's working in AP 13 hours a day. We build a common language here. And that's the important takeaway on this is it's taking the time up front to design your risk assessment and to put language around it really matters. One of the risk factors that we talked about was financial impact or materiality. And this is one that, I have seen some folks not include this, but most of the time, I'll call it 8 or 9 times out of 10, they've got some permutation materiality in there. And, it really starts to put a hard number into your definition of risk tolerance or risk appetite, if you want to pull that term forward. It's because it is objective, it's generally easy to get your arms around in some way or another. Now, when we're taking this approach from a public sector perspective or by department or by function or by program, you can easily understand like, hey, what's my budget for this department? What's my funding level for the program? That starts to frame it out, but it's not the end of the story either. There's different types of related financial information, volumes, cash moving through a particular balance. It could be, a balance on your statement of net position, you name it. But when you also think about materiality, it shouldn't just be a number. It should be a number that's influenced by different types of tolerance of risk. One of the things that I always bump into in public sector is like this, hey, what's going to cause the state auditor to come in and start looking? What's going to put me on the front page of the paper? What's that regulatory or investigative trigger that's going to put me in a bad place, cause reputation damage? It's interesting. I had one client that was like, man, $15. If someone's buying a $15 mocha latte caramel macchiato at Starbucks, I want to know about it. Okay, that's a different level of materiality than perhaps some people care about, but it speaks to that reputation damage that they were sensitized to. And then there's really when the rubber hits the road, where if you have exposure or loss exposure that could impact ongoing operations or your ability to meet your objectives or your mission, that's a real problem. So I think there are very specific ways of talking about that. And we try to, again, when we're defining these risk factors, we try to have at least some sort of way to frame it out and dialogue about it. So we have definitions. This is one where, there's a specific framework that, and I think this one was from North Carolina, but the OSC had their own specific materiality framework. I think Armix has something very similar. And, this one, they're using 5% of total assets as a starting point. And that leads you to at least some quantitative numbers that you can then pull down and start to adjust. And whatever your methodology is, it needs to be consistent, and it needs to really be condoned by senior leadership. And then once you kind of have that number, then it's just a matter of putting it into a definition and your risk ratings that you can use in your risk assessment process. Right. All right. But again, it's just a starting point, just again, to reiterate some of the other things that might matter. There's the reputation risk, there's oversight, external investigative triggers. There's, for those of you that have external funding that's not just coming from, from tax dollars, Could an error cause you to lose funding or have to return funding? There's a lot of different considerations here, and it needs to be really pragmatically evaluated. All right, there's another one of these criteria that I want to talk about that's super important. I would argue that this needs to be in absolutely every single one of the risk assessments, at least for the internal audit function, and that is control maturity. How mature is your control? How effective is the control? Is the control properly designed? Is it operating as it's intended? Is it doing it over a period of time? Whatever your definition of maturity is, it should be kind of similar to that. But at the bottom of a particular scale, there could be what we're calling informal, ad hoc, whatever words you want to give it. But you start to come up with definitions. These are controls that are fragmented. They're not really defined, that lacks policies and procedures, high exposure to change. And this is where organizations feel stressed. This is where the risk is. And then maybe you have repeatable. You're kind of working your way up the maturity model here. Maybe controls have some policies. They're not great, but they kind of get by. You have more clarity on roles and responsibilities, but maybe strict accountability is lacking, high reliance on certain people. A lot of organizations kind of live in this area because getting to the top is expensive. Maybe you have more formalized controls, and this is more specific to regulated industries or areas that have specific regulatory oversight. Control maturity really needs to be clearly defined, and it needs to, I think, be, if not central in your risk assessment process, it should be an area where you really do slow down in that workshop and really try to pull out the details. All right, so putting these risk criteria into practice, this will help us kind of wrap up the first step in the risk assessment process. But I mentioned the idea of like a risk assessment being done in the dark, by the internal audit team on a spreadsheet, and you finish that thing in 4 hours, man, way to go. Well, the whole point of this is to make sure that it's the voice of the customer, the voice of the organization. If you want to get Six Sigma, on me here, it needs to reflect the voice of the organization, not the voice of internal audit. And that's where this art starts to come in. How do you do that in such a way that it is facilitative and you're pulling in information and facilitating, not just recording what you think, because that's a recipe for an ineffective assessment. Keep the number of criteria to 5 or less. I mean, for those of you that have worked with me on these things, you're like, man, Nick, you never do that. You're at least at like 6 to 8. Okay, fine. 5 or less is a really good starting point because it focuses the conversation. If you have 12 of these criteria, these can be a long meeting, right? And they start to overlap with one another. I mean, keeping it short, concise, and pretty rigid on what those criteria are matters. There's nothing magical about 5 or less. Make it work for you, but try not to go. If you're above 10, I'm going to argue that there's too many. Clearly, we've taken the time to talk about how important it is to really define these risk criteria, define that language, understand the ratings and training folks on that. Invest that time up front. It will save you many, many, many hours down the line. And also you can tune it up, session after session, year over year. This thing only gets better over time. Maybe I'm channeling my inner Stewart here. Pressure testing your risk definition. Maybe go out to your stakeholders and be like, hey, Skip, does this make sense to you? Like, if we ask you to talk about your department in this context, like, how does that feel? What is it? Does that make sense? Okay, here's the definitions. And I always get good feedback because the way I think isn't the way that everybody else thinks. So, just doing a dry run or just putting that out ahead of time, especially if you're building this thing for the first time. Using risk ratings, like the 2-level or 3-level, I think works the best. Anything like 5-level, I can't differentiate the 5 levels. I've tried it before, and it becomes sort of like an internal battle. Like, no, it's not a 3, it's a 4, it's a 2, or it's a 3. Just force someone to make the decision. It's high or it's low. High, medium, low even can have problems in terms of differentiation. I told you about using calculated aggregated risks. I think I'm going to show you what that means over on the screen here. You can tinker with this idea, like a risk score. Like we actually give weightings to some of these. There's a formula up here that you'll see. But it can pull in weightings. It can pull in different criteria. Like maybe a high is much higher than a low. I'm an old Six Sigma guy, and I use quality functional deployments, or QFDs, that do something similar. And that's how this actually kind of took form. So if you want to look up Six Sigma QFDs, man, have a blast. But consider how to come up with those aggregate risk ratings, and that will give you a way to literally sort descending and see what you've got. Just be careful with the sort, you don't mess things up. Ahead of time, train your participants. Keep copies handy. I told you about keeping your risk criteria there. It really comes in handy to say, all right, everybody pause, pull up your cheat sheet. Is this a high or a medium? Here's the definitions, and then it really becomes self-evident. And for those of you that do like to kind of just pre-populate things and do the internal audit way, have at it. I do not like coming into these workshops with a completely blank or unpopulated workbook for these risk assessments. I would encourage you to just say, hey, based on my knowledge of the organization, I see it this way. And that's our starting point for the dialogue. Do you agree with me or do you disagree? Here's why I think it's a high. Oh, you do disagree. Well, let's have that dialogue now. So you're immediately entering the conversation with perspective and an opinion, which I think matters. So that's it for step one. Step two is really about the audit universe. The audit universe is a model of the organization. It's a model of your department. It's a model of a particular process. And I'll show you more of what I mean by that. But this is where you really start to go out and verify that you really do understand how the organization is structured. You understand what it's doing. You understand who's doing it and how they're doing it. It ensures your complete understanding, complete in the sense that there's nothing missing. If you don't have a complete risk assessment, if there are functions or programs missing, well, you're not fully evaluating the risk posture of the organization. This step is important to making sure that you can check off that sort of completeness assertion. It should include all functions, all departments, all programs, all fill in the blank. It also helps really drive accountability. Frequently, we're going to have who owns that process, or who's the supervisor and who's the frontline manager, who's the first and second in charge on this. But it drives accountability. It also helps you elicit information systems, to get that population of information systems, which ultimately your internal audit group, specific to IT or IT internal audit, would find useful, and hopefully they have something that maps systems to processes, but maybe not. So that's what this audit universe is defined for. Here's a quick snapshot, kind of how it looks. So here we have, here's some of our risk factors and risk criteria over here. It's just kind of snipped off, but in this case, here's the audit domain, here's the audit area, kind of like a categorization and maybe just process function department, the owner and the system. So that's kind of how this is set up. Just to give you a feel for what I'm talking about here. Now, by taking this approach and kind of categorizing audit areas into audit domains, you are modeling the full organization, right? This becomes what your list of what could be audited. And I at least when I'm doing this with internal audit groups from an internal audit risk assessment, I encourage folks to think about all the entities that are in the group. There could be component units, there could be departments, functions, there's specific programs, there's sometimes joint ventures, you name it. There's all sorts of different ways of thinking about what should be on the list, but even down to processes. And this really gets to one of the challenges with building the model. What level do you take it? Function, process, sub-process, activity. You can go on and on this thing, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but think Goldilocks here. you don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole. You do want to get to that sort of sweet spot. And I'm just going to jump to that. This Goldilocks level is all about taking it to a level that you can effectively articulate the organization in a way that people recognize, in a way that you can effectively frame your discussion of risk criteria to that area, in a way of not getting sucked into the overt details and never working your way out of it. For you guys, I would encourage you for now to stay away from sub-processes and activities, except Stuart, and that's kind of where his mind is drifting. Stuart, that's what you get for speaking up, man. I'm going to use your name for the rest of the entire presentation. So yeah, we're going to keep this at the department function program level, at least, as we're talking about our departments and agencies. How do you make sure that it's complete? Well, I don't know. Go to your CAFR, or go to your budget for the year. Go to your org chart. Make sure that you've represented everybody somewhere on this list. Before you get into the risk assessment process proper, which is step 3, maybe sit down with a handful of stakeholders, senior leadership, but to make sure that they recognize kind of how you've modeled the organization. Just a short meeting, like, hey, is this kind of how you see things work? Because when you get into the risk assessment, you're going to be asking them that same question. There could be a lot of meetings that come up here, but that's okay. If you got a large organization, then you've got a large organization. Take the time, get the model right. That's just going to pay dividends year over year. And expect complexity. Small organizations, I see 80 to 100 rows on these particular tools. Larger organizations, double that easily. There are shortcuts that are available for the time constrained. It's a matter of what is the level of detail that you have time to get into. How much competency can you develop using this approach and using the resources that you have in your internal organization. But remember, this is where you're setting the stage, you're building the foundation upon which you're going to continue to build your perspectives on operations and risks to organizational objectives. So this part is super important. And one of the weird things that I never expected to come out of this process when I'm working with my clients is, like, it's mind-blowing. Like, putting this tool in front of people that haven't seen it before, especially folks that are higher up, they're like, man, this is great. I mean, I recognize my organization, and there's a lot of value in what you're putting in front of me, and putting the organization up against these risk criteria in this way. It forces you to document your understanding and defend your perspectives on risk. And the cool thing is that by taking this approach, you've already got buy-in. This isn't your assessment. This is the organization's assessment. They gave you the feedback. They told you about the risk criteria. They told you about how to model the organization. And they told you about how to rate the risk criteria for each area. So you already have buy-in. So one of the other things here that I wanted to highlight, and that's this last bullet. Taking the time on a particular audit area or domain to really understand what the hell they do, that absolutely has to be part of this process on the front end. I've worked with 2 different types of organizations. One's where this information is already largely available in a way that is written down. Like, if you go to the budget itself, a lot of this is probably already available. Who's in the function, what do they do, how long have they been there, what is the budget, the type of funding available, what's coming up, like what were the priorities this year and what's coming up next year, specific regulations, like all of this stuff is great information to have. And to have before you go into the risk assessment process. So again, having those meetings up front to build out your audit universe is really critical, and also documenting this in a way that makes sense. I will show you how we've done that in the tool, and I'll step into that in just a little bit. But a lot of organizations already have this, and you can just leverage it to get sort of to accelerate through it. That's one of the shortcuts available. But if you don't have it and you're not sure, well, now you're stuck having to spend the time up front to do it. This is a challenge. I mean, this whole process is a challenge if you're starting from square one. It is time consuming. There's, increasing the relative percentage of time that you have available and resources and budget you have available to do a risk assessment like this. It might feel counterintuitive on the front end of it, but I tell you, it's going to work longer term. For larger organizations, you could spend your entire year doing this if you're not careful. And that's where the paralysis comes in. And, my team and I, we've seen this before. We try to advise around it. This particular process, it's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet to solve everybody's woes. There's a certain amount of complexity that if you are going to understand the organization and understand it well enough to provide value and risk perspective, you're going to have to figure out how to eat that elephant. But just be mindful of how much time you spend doing it and look for shortcuts that perhaps you can power your way through it. Go broad versus deep initially, and then go deep over time. There's ways to cut through this. If you don't have the right tone at the top, you're also going to have a hard time. You need leadership support. You doing this from internal audit on your own, I've seen work, but it's just out of pure due diligence and effort. It works a lot smoother and easier when you've got, an executive director or a secretary that is pushing this down as a priority. Everybody generally falls in line. Other challenges, you may not have the right skill sets on your team to do this, or maybe you've only got 1 or 2 people that can do this. You're going to either have to bring that inbound or develop it internally. So to do this process right, you need to have the right executive presence. You need to be able to hold your own with the leaders of the organization, relate to them on what their priorities are, and relate to them in a way that helps them understand the risk that you're looking at and bringing the two together. Having a staff auditor do this by themselves is not optimal. Now, over time, they can participate and help contribute to it, but making sure you've got the right executive presence to pull this off is something to think about as you're planning it. And the other thing that I've seen is audit groups like to stick to their audit process. This is intended to break the back of your audit process every single year that you do it, or every period that you do it. It's forcing you to kind of open up, keep your eyes open to changes in risk, and be open to not only changing your audit plan, but also how you evaluate risk as well. And there's this concept of like, I always tell, my kids, my teams, we need to do what's right, not necessarily what is convenient. And I think that takes all of this page into context here. And sometimes it's hard to articulate. Sometimes it's hard to get the buy-in from your leadership to do what's right. But to make that argument, you need to put it in the context of risk that matters to the organization. In public sector, fear sometimes works more effectively than in the private sector. Do you really want to have that audit report coming out? Do you want to have the state auditor coming in? Do you want to be, that front page risk matters. So point being, I'll wrap up this particular section by talking about the audit universe. It matters. Developing it matters. It's really hard to do. It takes time, but it's not required. And that's sort of what, maybe I'm undermining myself here. It takes time. It's not required. The IA standards don't require it. Require a risk assessment, but not this audit universe. I think it should be required, but hey, that's just me. Let's move into the third and fourth polling question. I think we're doing back to back here. Say true or false. Risk criteria used in this assessment are risk events as defined by COSO. True or false? I will give you a hint. The answer is false. These are not risk events. These are risk criteria. They are proxies for risk. If we were doing risk events, we'd be here not only all week, but we would be doing risk assessments across your whole organization all year. And a lot of organizations actually define ERM functions to do just that. Well, there's 12 of you out there that still want to make this true. which is fine. The answer is false. Okay. I think we've got a few more of you out there. See if we can pull you in. We'll shut it down in about 5 seconds here. All right, Maddie, let's shut it down and we'll move on to the next question.
All right.
All right. We're talking about complexity in audit universes here. And again, the complexity can be measured by maybe how big your department is. So, I mean, when you think about your department, I mean, how big is your risk assessment going to be? How many departments, functions, programs, or entities are in your organization? Are you on the small side? Are you on the big side?
And Nick, I am hearing from some people in our chat talking about how department level can be overwhelming and what are some activities that an office level can work on within a department. So feel free to chime in on this. We did hear from Dorothy, who said that their organization sometimes looks at department operations, payroll, firefighting, or they look at those as categories, but often use government functions. So is there one approach that you feel works better than another for analyzing?
Yeah, I would argue that you first got to at least get the whole organization, the whole department, capital D department, mapped. Okay, so if you then have the whole department mapped, and I heard fire in there. So we're doing one of these right now with a county, and you got things like health and human services in there. You got fire, you've got the sheriff. I mean, you've got all sorts of things in some of the municipalities. Those could be an entire risk assessment itself. So I would argue that if you can do it at that top level, just saying fire or health and human services, okay, that might not be sufficient precision, but it's going to help you at least map it and take a first pass at it. And again, I'm going to channel Stuart here. You could then just say, you know what, we have some concerns that are coming out of this on that particular, function. Let's do an audit on that. And then in the audit level, you can further break it out. Or you can look at ways of actually going into and defining sub-processes or processes within, or even functions within one of those department level that's going to help you get to the next level. But if you do that, the whole risk assessment gets geometrically bigger. So this is all about the Goldilocks. Like step one, get completeness. Make sure you've got everything nailed down there. Step two, if you're not feeling your precision is proper and you need to take a deeper dive, do it. But when do you do it? You don't need to do it all in a given fiscal year. Maybe it's going to take you time to build that out. So I think it's a matter of how do you stage it potentially over time, unless you can get a lot of resources to carve into it in a shorter amount. Okay,
thank you, Nick.
Yep. All right, so a lot of you guys are sort of what I'll call the mid-size, somewhere between 50 and 200, which makes a lot of sense. And those of you in greater than 200, yeah, this risk of analysis and paralysis because of the size, it matters. I can talk further about that, and there is no easy answer, unfortunately. I would just continue to urge you, start with that top level understanding, make sure you've got completeness, and then where you can drill down and should drill down, that's your next step. All right, we've got one more polling question here. We're gonna try to knock some of these things out. I didn't really focus too much on this earlier, so I might just do this one live with you guys. But when you do an IT risk assessment, that is an altogether different type of mapping. I mentioned the idea of eliciting these systems that are mapped to functions and departments or even processes, and that should be used by your IT auditors to kind of dovetail into what they're doing. But I'll make the argument that an IT risk assessment is altogether a different activity than what you're doing here. There can be and should be IT components, security, program change, software development, you name it, sort of at the IT domain level, but it's not necessarily going to be at a system or infrastructure level. So I would argue here, and I think you need to start that question there, Maddie, but I would say that this, you should be using a separate IT risk assessment to really facilitate the IT Audit Universe and a correspondingly separate IT risk assessment.
Okay, and it looks like we are at about 87%. I'm waiting on 4 of you to decide true or false.
Pick true. The answer is true.
Pick true.
Pick me. Pick me.
Okay, 2 more. And we'll go ahead and end that poll.
Great. All right. And we're going to accelerate a little bit. I told you I would take time, in steps 1, 2, and 3. And the last couple here we'll move through pretty quick. So we've made it all the way through criteria and the modeling, and now we get into sort of the characterization. This is where you actually start talking to folks about your model, about the audit universe in the context of each one of these risk criteria. I think you already know, you've heard me say this by now, but these are facilitated interviews. You're going to make sure that your stakeholders agree with your organizational model, including the processes and systems and the accountability. They're going to help you characterize these audit areas, whether it is processes, programs, functions, departments. But then you're getting the details. Now you're starting to get the perspective. And this is where you need to capture that information in a way that you can ingest it, retain it, memorialize it, and move later. But what comes out of this is you get buy-in, right? You get buy-in on the risk and maturity of controls that come out of this. Basically, it becomes the organization's risk assessment. And one of the things that I really like to highlight here about this is there's, in my opinion, 2 ways of thinking about risk. There's the compliance view, you have to do it. The standards say it. And then there's the risk view. Yeah, we should do this because, it's going to help us achieve our objectives. It's the right thing to do. We are clearly in the risk view modality here. We want you to do it. We think you're going to end up with better design controls. We think you're going to get management buy-in along the way. And if you do that, it's probably going to be more sustainable over time, as opposed to doing it, in the dark, or you just kind of have to do it. So we're going to go through the process. People don't really care. They don't buy into it. You're not going to really understand the right risks, and you're certainly not going to understand the controls, which is going to lead to poorly designed controls, ineffective controls. And it's probably going to, wither on the vine within a year or 3. So we want you to use the facilitated approach here to get that buy-in, to get people to say, yeah, this makes sense. We should be doing this periodically. This makes sense to me. We should be using this to really better align our resources and talk about things that matter as opposed to just the way things are. And if you do this right, if you use this risk management approach properly, one of the cool things is that the de facto byproducts of using this approach is compliance. You will be compliant if you take the risk view. Anyway, I think that's kind of cheeky and fun. It is, remember, do what's right, not what's convenient. But it's not only right, it's what's effective. So when you're doing these workshops, just a little bit of guidance here. Again, it's not as easy as you think. Sure, I'll have a meeting, we'll do this. Well, let me just give you a couple tips that have kind of worked for my team in the past. Ahead of time, ahead of these meetings, clarify your objectives. Hey, we're meeting to accomplish the following. Give them all the tools, tell them about the process, give them the definitions, let them do their own homework ahead of time. Try to come as educated as possible. Here I say, defy expectations that people sometimes hold of internal audit. This is all part of like having that executive presence. You have to go toe to toe with these departmental leaders in a way that shows that you understand their organization, or you're in the process of understanding it, but you're going to bring the risk management lens to the conversation. You're going to establish that risk view, and you're going to hold them accountable for defending their organization, articulating it to you, within that lens. When you're in these meetings, again, have printouts, explain this criteria up front. Just make sure that people have the common language and know how to talk to you and to each other using this framework that you've defined. Pre-populate that framework where you can, where you have the facts. If you don't have the facts, don't make it up. Have an agenda, do your intros, make sure people understand the process, have the guidance ready. And I always have a kickoff deck to go in, and for the first 5 to 10 minutes, we're doing just that. We're establishing expectations. These things generally go no less than 60 minutes, unless you got a real small kind of something. Always have 2 people in it, someone that facilitates and has that executive presence, and someone that is scribing. Present on screen, share remotely. Zoom works great for this. I think it's a really excellent way of doing this remotely. Gets people engaged. You know, as you're doing these processes, always pausing and making sure that you're not driving too much, getting feedback, making sure people understand that their view is being heard, asking things like, is this how things really work? Is this an accurate representation of your organization? And then actually using the tool, like doing it live. Hey, I'm making this a hide. I think I captured that properly. Like, and then your scribe is typing it in, and people can actually see it moving and happening live. And then as you're closing things out, you know, reiterate the risk criteria definitions, use the handouts, confirm the risk ratings as you're doing it. Just to, again, this is facilitation, not dictation, right? We want you to make sure that you are pulling in risk perspectives, and then you get to synthesize them and make them your own. All right, so what does one of these things look like? I figured we could just spend a minute here and just say, hey, you know, let's start with it. This is the North Carolina Department of IT. And I just want to show you a couple things here. And I'm going to, you know, we're not going to spend too long in here, but we have, first of all, a whole agenda of meetings. You can see all the meetings that we had for each one of these audit areas. You can see all the different types of attendees here. You know, there were, how many, 20, there's a lot of these things. Okay. So 21 particular meetings. You can see that each one of these is about an hour to an hour and a half long. We had, I'm skipping to Audit Universe for a second. I'll end on that. We have audit area descriptions. Remember I told you about, like, come in, understand what the heck these folks do, understand it in a way that at least you have the bare bones understanding, and you can confirm that with them and you can tune this up. But having that information available to you, again, very nice to have ahead of time and to memorialize as you're thinking about audit areas in the future. You have your risk factor guide. You know, in this particular one, we actually had specific risks that focus on service delivery and ineffective use of state funds. We also had risk factors and all the definitions that go into it. And we'd print this thing out and have it right next to us in these meetings. And we had the materiality worksheet. We also had the internal audit vision, right? The presentation that we had also had the department's, not basically DIT, mission and objectives. So we'd always put that out there and remind people what it is we're working on and why. And then here is the actual Audit Universe. And there's a lot of stuff in here that, you know, we tinkered with, but how many? I said 5. How many did I do? I did 10. So clearly I'm eating crow here. We did use an aggregate risk score. And you can see, you know, we have audit domains. These are just, you know, how the organization is, or, you know, I guess, structured, and the specific departments or sub-departments in each one, who the owners are and who the secondary manager is. And then as we go through, you know, the rating process for each one of these in our dialogues, we'd have a scribe that would be typing these in. And anything that is higher than a low, we would put feedback in here regarding why. And this thing goes on and on and on. So there's a lot of content in here, but the fun thing is using this aggregate risk score, you can then sort descending and, you know, start to get perspective on, you know, why is the billing process, you know, riskier than, you know, rates driving some of the billings versus, you know, a completely different group. So this was a first stab, and ultimately this, and for this particular project, this led into an audit plan for internal audit to then figure out how do they take a deeper dive in some of these areas. And by the way, there's a lot more higher risk areas than this particular internal audit department had the ability to carve into. Remember, it's about giving you a defensible approach to an internal audit plan. All right, let me hop out of here. So that was just a few minutes there. I told you that, you know, the tail end of this, steps 4 and 5, I think are pretty perfunctory. So I'm going to just highlight, you know, once you have the risk assessment done, now you have to evaluate the risk exposures and the gaps. This is all about looking for areas that highlight exposure where you've got poor control maturity, the combination of higher risk, lower control maturity, that's a problem. And those are some of the areas that you should be looking at. That leads to perspective that you can talk to your organization about and confirm with them. Hey, we finished our risk assessment. This is kind of how things turned out. We see some of these combinations popping up. That leads us to think the following. We're going to build that into our audit plan. Does that make sense to you? And it gives you a platform upon which you can stand. And once you have those perspectives, now it's about having your responses. And what is your response? We've talked about the internal audit plan. There could be a management response. Hey, your billing process is apparently off the rails. We spent 2 hours on this thing, and there's a lot of concerns. Here's what they are. We don't think an internal audit's the way to go about this. We think management needs to take an immediate action plan that looks like the following. So that's really the first and second lines of defense that need to get activated there. Some groups have ERM. You can factor this process into ERM and the formal ERM risk responses. If you need to build out a more formalized program to manage the risk. For those of you that have compliance or QC or QA functions, there's another way to get involved there. But it needs to be an organization-wide response to the risk, not just internal audit. And again, there's 4 ways to respond to risk. I think you guys know this. You can build controls, you can avoid the risk, you can share it, or you can accept it. We are focusing on number 1 here. Most of the time it's about, hey, we need to put internal controls in place. And from an internal audit perspective, we need to validate and monitor that those controls are effective, which leads us to your audit plan. Now, everybody's got different audit plans. Some of you have 3-year plans, some of you have 1-year plans, some of you have kind of a plan, but not necessarily, and it changes a lot. Coming out of your risk assessment, I would at least recommend a multi-year audit plan. There's going to be more stuff on the plate than you have resources to handle. Remember, you need a defensible plan. You also need to come up with an approach if you need more resources. It says, here's all the stuff that I can't do. It's going to take me until 3 years from now to even get around to this. I think, Dorothy, you had mentioned that, this is just one of those ways of kind of factoring in what you can do. You cannot do it all, but you do need to articulate that you've thought about it. You have a plan. You may not have the resources, but you've got a perspective on how to use those resources. And this needs to be bubbled up to senior leadership so they can be comfortable with it. They need to be comfortable with it. Most of you probably need to get approval on your internal audit plans. And if you start talking in these terms, it might make some people a little uncomfortable. You might be surprised at the resources that kind of pop out of this process if you do it well. All right. So that's ultimately one of the deliverables that comes out of this. But along the way, you also need to make sure that you are communicating the results of this more broadly than just through an internal audit plan. You spend a heck of a lot of time doing it. If you did it really well, you start to embed risk management into the culture of the organization. You start to speak that same language. Setting up a way to formally convey those results, to increase transparency, to continually dialogue or periodically dialogue about risk, I think is an important component of this. It doesn't end in your internal audit plan. This should be a repeatable process that you start to build into the way that you guys work. It becomes the way that you talk. It is that common language that we've referred to. And ultimately, again, if you do this, it's going to be accretive to the organization, and it's going to build in its effectiveness over time in a way where risks are sort of inherently being understood by the group. People start to use that language. They start to formalize it into the way they work and the way that they are responding to the risks in their organization. It also helps articulate risks that really are outside of the internal audit group's ability to affect. Your job is to validate and monitor. You might be a catalyst of change to come in and give a flaming audit report now and again. But there are areas that are outside of your scope, outside of your purview, or just outside of your budgetary capability of meeting. And this is a nice way of saying, hey, here's the risk, we're covering this, the rest is unaddressed. unless it's by one of the other areas that we've talked about: management, response, QA, compliance, you name it. And there are ways of getting leverage risk coverage if it's not internal audit. I'll talk a little bit about analytics, the ERM function. Few of you have ERM. It's just expensive to maintain, and honestly, it's probably one of the first places that gets cut or forgotten when times are tight. The first and second lines of management, I think, is probably our primary place of trying to make sure that risks are being contemplated. But you also have what I call line level projects. You might have a project improvement team. You might have folks that are more focused on that, management or first and second line that might be embedded like a QA function. But you also have the ability to share risk. Maybe you're outsourcing stuff. Maybe you have components of your process outsourced to a third party. There are insurance ways, especially on cyber, of sharing the risk. So there are other ways. Hey, this is a risky area. Let's not do it anymore. We're done. We're going to give it to that group over there. Or they can help us manage the risk, and it's just sharing it. All right. We're reaching the top of the hour here. We've got about 10 more minutes, and we're right on track. So we've gone through the risk assessment objectives, developing the understanding, facilitating shared perspectives across the organization, identifying risk exposures and possible control gaps, building your audit plan, rationalizing your resources, using the risks and the resources that you have, and then communicating those risks out in your way of responding to them and not responding to them, right? Holding people accountable. So I think we've talked about all of that. And again, you've seen this slide before, but what comes out of this process? What's in it for you? An understanding of the business. What's in it for the business? An understanding of the risks associated with those processes. You've come up with a way of measuring the subjective risk and control maturity that's not your way. It is the management's view. You achieve buy-in on how it's measured and basically what those risk exposures are and what the inherent risks and control gaps are coming out of your process. So you get an understanding, you get measurement, and you get a buy-in on the assessment results using this approach. So once that's done, now what do? Well, theoretically, you should be monitoring it. And a lot of us do this annually. That's fine. That's what the standards say, at least annually. But what if we carve this thing up? So Dorothy, to your point, hey, there's so much here, I can't do it all at once. Well, carve it up quarterly, do a fourth of it throughout the year. Do updates through senior leadership teams. Have management do this process, once it's defined, through a self-assessment, using clearly defined risk criteria in a clearly defined model of the organization. Put it on them, delegate it to management. And there are cool tools out there, and I'll talk about that in a second. Risk analytics and data analytics are another great way to kind of get into this. I like to say doing more with less and doing it faster and doing it better than the way we're doing it today. But there's never been a time in history when data was more available and the tools were as affordable as they are right now. Unless you ask me tomorrow, and then it's probably even more so then. But this is all about understanding risks from a quantitative perspective, leveraging data to identify and to monitor those risks. This takes time as well. And for those of you that have not gotten into the risk analytics or data analytics bandwagon, you need to. You really need to push your organizations there. The idea here is that you can cover more risks with fewer resources. Like, do you really need to be auditing AP the same way manually every year? Or can you audit by exception using the data that you've got? Probably the latter. Fraud risk assessments and fraud detection using this approach is far superior than, at least transactionally, than doing a periodic audit or just waiting for the hotline to ring. But to do this well, you need to do it with key risk indicators. You need to think about how do you get those indicators and the tolerances so you can audit by exception. And eventually you could also even expose the data, to publish the data, to provide self-service drill down for different parts of the organization to use the data and embed that into their processes. Now, everybody's starting to use this and think about risk in terms of the data that's available. There's a lot of tools out there, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Tableau is great. I'm sure some of you have exposure to that. Power BI is great. These things are super affordable. I mean, a couple $100 a year, depending on how many you need. But at least the Viz tools allow you to plug into some of your systems quickly and easily and start to build out these risk indicators in a way that can be automated. But there's a lot of other tools out there too. There's online survey tools like Conference.io that I use sometimes for these types of workshops. You've got integrated risk management or IRM tools, Audit Board, Galvanize, ServiceNow, Metric Stream, IBM Open Pages. Goodness, I mean, Hyperproof. There's scads of them, and they're all vying for market, presence right now. On the IT side, you've got like ZenGRC and Aptega. ServiceNow falls into that one, but there's a whole bunch of others there too. There are tools out there where some of the regulations and the regulatory authorities are actually already built out that you can just import into these tools. And the tools are relatively affordable, $20K a year up to $100K a year. I know some of you are choking on the 100K. I get it. But these things are also potentially complex. They're non-trivial. You got to build your risk taxonomies. You probably have a tendency to get stuck in that risk event context as opposed to our shortcut method. So be careful. They're not highly flexible. They are less flexible. They're more formalized. They're meant for like longer term, more sustainable, repeatable GRC, ERM practices. And they do require a lot of care and feeding. So anyway, just a quick snapshot of what's out there. And now I think we're going to get into the final questions of the day. I think there's 3 of them here back to back. So pay attention. Let's get these final CPE questions out of the way. What is not a factor of a successful risk assessment workshop as discussed today? Not a factor. Stakeholder involvement, kickoff deck, explaining process and objectives, keeping your sessions short and to the point, and achieving buy-in. Yeah, you get the drift. The sessions need to be as long as they are. I wouldn't make them over 2 hours. People start to glaze over like a donut. All right, we got 35 of you. Guys, when we're done here, this is going to be probably it. I think we've just got a couple slides left. All right, we've got 39. All right. Let's head on to the next one. Polling question number 7. How long should a risk assessment workshop take? I think I just told you this. As long as it takes. Except you don't want it to go too long, right? I mean, I would say optimally 60 to 90 minutes. If you're having a 4-hour risk assessment session, you're going to have some pissed off attendees. So I would argue, again, keep it in the 60 to 90 minute range, maybe up to 2 hours, but still by then people are starting to lose interest. You can have multiple sessions, just break it up, maybe to 90-minute sessions. All right, we've got 2 left there. And then we're going to head to question number 8 in the last question of the day. All right.
Giving you guys a couple more seconds. And there we go. We'll end the poll.
Cool. And we'll go on to question 8. And we'll wrap things up.
All right.
How can GRC tools be leveraged in the risk assessment process? Online tools, real-time voting, risk frameworks, all of the above. Yeah, you got it. It's all these things, plus some other functionality that you probably don't need, that you didn't know you needed. We've done a survey, and by survey, I mean actually evaluating a lot of these tools, dozens of them. And there are so many of them out there. I think what's really pertinent right now is the risk and regulatory authority data that is available that can be imported. That's kind of where a lot of this is going. I mean, statutes, laws, standards, they're changing every day. And how does an organization, a compliance organization, keep tabs on that? Well, there's a lot of cool AI tools being built that actually do that automatically. 38. All right, you guys got the right answer. Okay, So let's just wrap up there. I think we're right on time. So our view of risk, Nick's view of risk. Organizations miss objectives and incur errors and losses because basically one of three things, and only three things. They did not expect a risk. They were blindsided. There's unseen risk, or there's a risk that they identified, but they just didn't manage it properly, or they were trying to manage it properly and the controls that they built failed. It's one of those three things. And the process that we went through today helps with every one of these. You're going to avoid being blindsided by thinking about a complete model of your organization. You're going to build risk criteria that are tailored to your organization. You're going to evaluate risks through these risk criteria across the whole organization to make sure that you have perspective on where the controls are. And where the risks are highest, you need to have the most robust controls. That's going to give you perspective about control maturity or immaturity. So we've given you a way to think about, unseen risk, unmanaged risk, and control failure in the context of this sort of slightly atypical risk assessment process. But whatever risk assessment process that you use, I mean, the fact that you have organizational objectives, you need to have a way to manage risk to those objectives. And that is largely in your court as internal audit leaders. So we're going to end today really on just talking about keys to success here. Get tone at the top right. Get people in your court talking about how important risk management is. If you're able to embed risk management into the culture of the organization, you're going to 10x your effectiveness. It's not you screaming into the wind. It's you coaching and facilitating and enabling, and it starts to catch fire. That common language starts to come out over time. Invest in that universe, that audit universe. It's critical, even though it may not always be at the level of precision that you want it to be, you got to start and have completeness first, and then you can get into it over time. Make it collaborative, make it your process, but your organization's perspectives, and then use those perspectives to develop your own opinions. Prioritize your resources, communicate your results, and then monitor those results over time. This is critical to kind of what you do as an organization in internal audit. Whether you use this process or a more formalized process or something in between, hopefully you got a couple different ideas out of this today. But that's it. I think we have maybe 1 minute left. If there's any questions out there, let me know. Otherwise, I am very thankful to have got to hang out with 40 of you today. After this session, we will send out a survey. We will send out the slides and some of the tools that I showed you. And, with a little luck, maybe you guys start to factor this into your organization. So with that said, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's 11 o'clock on the nose, and if any questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes. But other than that, have a great rest of your morning and rest of your day.